There's a moment in almost every family where someone gets labeled. Maybe it's the golden child, maybe it's the perfect one. And then there's the scapegoat, the one who carries the weight of everyone else's unspoken anger, fear, and shame. If you've ever been that person, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You start to believe the problem is you, your voice, your choices, your very existence. But here's the truth. Scapegoating isn't about who you are. It's about a family system that needs someone to blame in order to avoid facing its own dysfunction. And sometimes the only way to stop carrying a story that isn't yours is to walk away. Research in family psychology shows that scapegoating happens when families unconsciously project their problems onto one person. It's never about that individual's actual character. It's about keeping the family from facing painful truths. Knowing this is the first step toward healing. Now let's slow that down because I want you to really hear it. If you were the child who was blamed for everything that went wrong, if you were told you were too much or never enough, if your role in the family was to carry the tension no one else wanted to name, please know this, that was never about your worth. That was about survival in a broken system. Here's what happens. Families, like any group of people, develop unspoken rules. Sometimes those rules are healthy. Love each other, take care of one another, tell the truth, even when it's hard. But in unhealthy families, the rule is often don't rock the boat. And when pain or dysfunction starts to surface, alcoholism, infidelity, mental illness, unprocessed grief, someone has to carry that pain so the rest of the system can pretend everything is fine. And often it's the child or sibling who is different, outspoken, sensitive, or simply unwilling to play along with the silence. That person becomes the scapegoat. I've spent years studying shame, and one thing I know for certain is that shame thrives in secrecy. Families will do almost anything to keep painful truths hidden, even if it means sacrificing one person's sense of self. Scapegoating is the perfect tool for that. By labeling one person the problem, the family avoids looking in the mirror. Instead of asking, why are we hurting? They point at the scapegoat and say, see, that's why. But here's the heartbreaking part. Children believe the story they're told. If you grow up being blamed, excluded, or ridiculed, you start to believe you are defective. Your nervous system wires itself around the idea that love is conditional, belonging is fragile, and worth is something you'll never quite earn. And that narrative doesn't just disappear when you become an adult. It follows you into relationships, workplaces, and even the way you talk to yourself when you're alone. Let me pause and say this again because it's important. Scapegoating is not proof that you are broken. It is proof that the family system was broken. There's a big difference. And I think for many of us, the healing begins when we finally separate our identity from the role we were forced to play. Some research calls this the black sheep phenomenon, but that phrase doesn't even come close to describing the level of harm it causes. Being a scapegoat means you weren't just misunderstood, you were systematically used as a shield. You were the distraction that kept everyone from dealing with their own pain. That is heavy. That is unfair. And that is not who you are. One of the bravest steps we can take is to start asking, what if their story about me isn't true? What if the problem wasn't me, but the way they needed me to carry blame so they didn't have to? That question cracks the door open. That's the beginning of reclaiming your voice. So if you've carried the weight of being the family scapegoat, I want you to imagine setting it down for just a moment. Imagine saying, this story was never mine to hold. Because the truth is, your worth was never up for debate. It was never defined by their projections, their silence, or their accusations. And it certainly isn't defined by the role they forced you to play. You are not their scapegoat. You are not their excuse. You are not the problem they needed you to be. You are whole, you are worthy, and you always have been. Being the scapegoat often means constant criticism, blame, and rejection. Studies on emotional trauma reveal that these invisible wounds can impact mental health as severely as physical abuse. Naming it for what it is, abuse, allows us to stop minimizing the harm. Here's the hard truth. When we think of abuse, most of us picture bruises, broken bones, or something you can point to and say, see, there's the evidence. But emotional abuse doesn't leave marks on your skin. It leaves marks on your sense of self. It changes the way you hear your own voice, the way you move through the world, the way you decide whether you're worthy of love or belonging. And because there are no physical scars, it's often dismissed or ignored, not just by families, but by the people living through it. If you grew up being blamed for everything that went wrong, constantly criticized or excluded from affection, that doesn't just sting in the moment, your nervous system actually adapts to it. Research shows that repeated exposure to rejection and humiliation wires the brain in the same way physical pain does. In fact, studies using brain imaging found that social pain, like being shamed or ridiculed, lights up the exact same regions as physical injury. So when you say it feels like it's killing me, that's not a metaphor. Your body is literally treating emotional abuse as real harm. But here's where it gets complicated. Because there are no bruises, survivors of scapegoating often question themselves. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I deserved it. Maybe it really was my fault. That self-doubt is part of the abuse. It's called gaslighting. Being told again and again that what you experienced isn't real until you start to wonder if you can even trust your own memory or feelings. And that's why naming it is so powerful. Saying, what I went through was emotional abuse, is not exaggeration. It's telling the truth. I've heard countless people say, well, at least I wasn't hit, as if the absence of physical violence makes the emotional pain somehow less valid. But here's what the data shows. The long-term effects of emotional abuse, anxiety, depression, difficulty trusting, hypervigilance, are often just as severe as those caused by physical harm. Sometimes they're even harder to heal because no one acknowledges they exist. And when you're the scapegoat, the abuse isn't just occasional, it's chronic. It's woven into the family dynamic. Every joke at your expense, every time you were left out, every moment someone rolled their eyes when you spoke, that adds up. Over time, those experiences become a story you tell yourself. I don't matter. I'm always the problem. I'll never be enough. That story lives in your bones until you decide to challenge it. So let's be clear, emotional abuse without bruises is still abuse. It's real, it's damaging, and if you've lived through it, your pain is not imaginary. The scars are there even if no one else can see them. And here's what matters most. You are allowed to name it, you are allowed to take it seriously, and you are allowed to step away from people who keep insisting that your pain doesn't count. Because it does. It always has. Boundaries are about self-respect, not punishment. When scapegoating is persistent, low contact or no contact may be the only boundary strong enough to protect your well-being. It's not about cutting people out of your life. It's about choosing peace over constant pain. Now, here's where so many of us get tangled up. From the time we were little, especially if we were scapegoated, we were often taught that our needs were inconvenient, that saying no was disrespectful, that speaking up was ungrateful. So the moment we even think about drawing a boundary, the shame gremlins show up. Who do you think you are? You're selfish. You're the problem, just like they said. And before we even speak, we've already convinced ourselves that protecting our well-being makes us the villain. But boundaries are not about pushing people away. Boundaries are about creating the conditions where love, respect, and dignity can exist. Without boundaries, relationships aren't relationships. They're arrangements. They're survival strategies. They're places where one person gets to take and the other learns to disappear. Research on relational health shows that boundaries are one of the strongest predictors of self-esteem. Why? Because every time you set a boundary, you are teaching yourself, my needs matter, my peace matters, I'm allowed to take up space. And when you've been scapegoated, when you've been told over and over that your voice doesn't count, that lesson is life-changing. Sometimes boundaries can look small on the outside, not answering a phone call at midnight, not engaging in conversations that are meant to shame you, deciding not to show up at every family gathering where you know you'll be targeted. But those small choices add up. They are acts of resistance against the role you were forced to play. They're you saying, I'm not available for my own mistreatment anymore. And let's be honest, sometimes the only boundary strong enough to protect you is distance. Low contact, or in some cases, no contact at all. That's the one nobody wants to talk about because it feels so final, so heavy. But for many people, going no contact isn't an act of cruelty, it's an act of survival. It's saying, I can't heal while staying in the same environment that keeps wounding me. I want to pause here because I know the grief that comes with even considering that choice. The guilt, the fear of being called the bad one again, the endless mental replay of maybe if I just tried harder. But let me tell you something. There is nothing selfish about protecting yourself from ongoing harm. There is nothing selfish about refusing to let someone else rewrite your worth. Boundaries are not walls, they are doors. They're the way you decide what gets to come into your life and what doesn't. And when scapegoating has been your reality, a boundary might be the very first time you've ever said, I choose me. So when you feel that tug of war inside between loyalty to a family that keeps hurting you and loyalty to your own heart, remember this. Choosing peace over constant pain is not selfish. It's sacred. It's the beginning of reclaiming the life that always belonged to you. One of the biggest fears scapegoats face is being labeled the bad one again for leaving. But stepping away isn't betrayal. It's reclaiming your voice. Research on trauma recovery shows that distancing from toxic dynamics is often the turning point in healing. And here's the part that takes most of us years to realize. When you finally step away, the family system almost always tries to pull you back with guilt. You'll hear things like, how could you do this to us? Or family is everything. Or maybe it's more subtle, silent treatments, backhanded comments, whispered stories about how cold you've become. It's all designed to remind you of the role you were given, the difficult one, the selfish one, the problem. And because you've heard those words your whole life, they sting. They make you question yourself all over again. But here's the truth. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do for yourself and even for the people you love is to say, I'm not playing this role anymore. That's not betrayal. That's integrity. That's refusing to collude in a story where you're the villain just so the family doesn't have to face its truth. I've read study after study on trauma recovery, and what we know is this: healing happens in safe environments, not in places where you're constantly re-traumatized. That means sometimes the most compassionate choice you can make for yourself is to create distance. And distance doesn't always mean forever. Sometimes it's a season, sometimes it's permanent. But either way, it's a choice rooted in courage. The myth of betrayal runs deep, though. We're taught from childhood that family comes first. But let me ask you, what if putting family first means putting yourself last over and over again? What if loyalty becomes another word for silence? At what point does family first become another way to say your pain doesn't matter? Choosing no contact is not about abandoning people. It's about refusing to abandon yourself any longer. And here's something I've seen countless times. When one person in a system finally refuses to carry shame that doesn't belong to them, it changes the entire system. Not always in the way we hope, but it shifts the dynamic. Sometimes others find the courage to speak the truth. Sometimes the family doubles down on denial. But either way, you've done something radical. You've broken the cycle. You've stopped participating in the dance of blame. So let's reframe this together. Going no contact isn't turning your back on love. It's turning your back on harm. It's refusing to let the people who were supposed to nurture you continue to wound you. And yes, that takes courage, tremendous courage, because it's not just about leaving a family structure. It's about leaving behind the hope that one day they'll finally see you finally love you without conditions. And grieving that loss is one of the hardest things you'll ever do. But on the other side of that grief is freedom. Freedom to define yourself outside of the role you were given. Freedom to build relationships where love feels safe, consistent, and real. Freedom to live without waiting for the next blow, the next accusation, the next round of shame. So when someone tells you that walking away makes you disloyal, I want you to remember this. It takes far more courage to step into the unknown of healing than it does to stay in a cycle of pain. Leaving is not betrayal. Sometimes leaving is the most honest expression of love for yourself, for the truth, and for the life you deserve to live. When you stop playing the role forced on you, you begin to write your own story. Healing may involve therapy, support groups, or simply practicing self-compassion daily. But the central truth is this: you are not who your family said you were. You are more. And you get to decide who you become. This is where the journey shifts from survival to freedom. For so long, being the scapegoat meant your story was written for you. Every insult, every accusation, every sideways glance, it became a script you never auditioned for, but were forced to play. You were told you were difficult, dramatic, lazy, selfish, or not good enough. And when you hear that long enough, it doesn't just sound like their opinion. It starts to sound like the truth. But healing begins the moment you realize you have a pen in your own hand. You don't have to keep reading from a script that was never yours. You get to ask, what if their version of me isn't real? What if I get to decide who I am? And I'll be honest, rewriting your story isn't easy. Those old lines are carved deep. They show up when you least expect it, in your relationships, in the way you react to criticism, even in the way you talk to yourself in the mirror. Shame has a way of sneaking in through the cracks, whispering, "Don't forget, you'll always be the problem." But every time you challenge that voice, every time you choose compassion over condemnation, you are editing the story. Sometimes rewriting means seeking therapy, where a professional can help you untangle what was projection from what is truth. Sometimes it means finding community with others who've walked the same path, people who can look you in the eye and say, "I know what that feels like, and you're not alone." And sometimes it's as small and powerful as learning to say to yourself, "I don't believe that old story anymore. I am worthy of love and belonging just as I am." What's remarkable is how the research supports this. Studies on post-traumatic growth show that people who step out of toxic family roles and begin redefining themselves often experience not just healing, but resilience. They become more self-awareness, more compassionate toward others, more grounded in who they truly are. It's not that the pain disappears, it's that it's no longer the lens through which they see their entire life. And here's the part I want you to really take in. You are not the character they wrote for you. You are the author now. You can choose what to keep, what to discard, and what to create. Maybe your story includes courage. Maybe it includes kindness. Maybe it includes building a life so different from what you came from that it feels like breathing fresh air for the first time. So healing isn't about proving your family wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you were never broken to begin with. It's about stepping out of a role that was too small for you and stepping into a story that honors your wholeness. You are not who they said you were. You never were. You are who you decide to become. And that is where true freedom begins. So here's the truth I want to leave you with. Being the family scapegoat was never about who you are. It was about who they needed you to be so the family could avoid facing its own pain. You carried shame that was never yours, wounds that no one acknowledged, and a role that tried to shrink your spirit. But you are not their scapegoat, you are not their excuse, and you are not their story. Healing means choosing yourself, setting boundaries without apology, stepping away when necessary, and rewriting the narrative you've been given into one that honors your worth. It's hard, it's messy, and it's courageous, but courage has always been the birthplace of freedom, love, and belonging. So if you're standing at that crossroads, unsure whether you can let go, unsure if you can break free from the cycle, I want you to know this. You already carry everything you need. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And your worth was never up for negotiation. Good luck on your journey. May you find the strength to choose peace over pain, truth over silence, and love, real love, over the counterfeit versions you were given. You are more than enough, and your new story begins now.